Good afternoon and welcome to the latest in the Cityforum series of podcasts. I'm Paul Cornish, I'm the Chief Strategist at Cityforum, and I'm the host for our series of defence and security related podcasts. It's a very great pleasure today to welcome back Air Marshal Sir Richard Knighton. And let me just give you a brief bio, as they say. Richard Knighton joined the Royal Air Force in 1988 as a university cadet and studied at Clare College, Cambridge, which is, funny enough, just down the road from where I'm speaking. He spent his early career working as an engineer and officer in a range of operational and staff appointments on aircraft such as Nimrod, Tornado and Harrier. After completing the Advanced Command and Staff course at the Defence Academy in 2004, he held appointments as a wing commander in the Harrier Integrated Project Team and as a military assistant to the Deputy Chief of Defence Staff for Equipment Capability. Sir Richard, you were the RAF's Logistics Force Commander and Station Commander at RAF Wittering from 2009 to 2011. And you spent time at the Royal College of Defence Studies in 2009. But since 2007, your career has largely taken you in the direction of strategic and capability planning, planning roles at RAF Air Command and centrally in the Ministry of Defence. You were Deputy Chief of Defence Staff for Financial and Military Capability in the MOD from 2018 to 2022 before moving in May last year back to the Royal Air Force to become Deputy Commander Capability at Air Command. And it was in your previous role as Deputy Chief of Defence Staff that we last met in June 2020. Doesn't that seem like a lifetime ago almost? To discuss, among other things, the effect of COVID-19 on the Ministry of Defence, the challenges to defence posed by the pandemic, the effects on MOD priorities and how the MOD could gain most from the so-called Fourth Industrial Revolution. We might well revisit one or two of these topics in our discussion today. But before we go any further, I wonder whether you could bring our Cityforum audience, and in fact me, to date by describing what the Royal Air Force's Deputy Commander Capability actually does.
That's a good question, Paul. It's great to be with you again. Thank you. So the structure in the Air Force is we have two deputy commanders, one who looks after operations, and my colleague Harv Smith, and then I look after future capability and people. In simple terms, we talk about Harv doing today and me doing tomorrow. Clearly, it's more complicated than that. But fundamentally, I'm interested in the long-term planning for the Air Force around our future capability, delivery of capability, infrastructure, people, support, digital, those kind of things.
Before we get into the future then, I wonder if we could start with the present. Just by asking you, what are the Royal Air Force's current capabilities in terms of platforms and people? And what's the current state of readiness? What are the capabilities? How is recruitment? And what about the platforms? I suppose the obvious points I'd raise under air platforms are such issues, or not issues, but they're facts on the ground, I suppose, or in the air. The Hercules, the C-130J, is about to go, I think, this year. It's going to be out of service. So that raises the obvious question about whether we have enough of the right sorts of strategic and medium transport available or will have in the future. The Tornadoes have gone, went some time ago. We're about to lose, I think, 24 of the Eurofighter Typhoon, or Tranche 1, by, I think, within the next couple of years, if I've got my facts right. So that poses the question, are we going to have enough fast jet combat aircraft? And then there's the Puma helicopter, a real workhorse of the Royal Air Force, and certainly in its involvement with the Army, which I think is also going out of service in 2025. So all those obvious questions about rotary and fixed-wing platforms, I wonder if you could bring us up to speed.
Yeah, sure. So, it's worth zooming out a little bit further, actually, and looking at what has happened to the Air Force's capability over the last decade or so. And when you look at it, we find ourselves in a position where we have been through the most remarkable period of recapitalisation. So by the time we get to 2025, pretty much everything in service will have been brought into service within the last 10 years. And when I compare that with the position that my colleagues and friends in the Army and the Navy have, the Air Force is in an enviable position with that level of investment. But it is true to say that the Air Force right now is the smallest that it's been in its history. And there are some deductions we can draw from those two facts. The first is that what the Air Force has today, or certainly will have by the time we get to 2025, when E7 will be in service, Protector will be in service, and we'll be working alongside our state-of-the-art F-35s, upgraded Typhoons, Voyager, rivet joint, P8, etc., is that the Air Force is going to need to extract the maximum value from those platforms that it has and the investment that the taxpayers made. And I'll perhaps talk a bit more about that later. But the second thing is that the enemy isn't going to stand still. Our potential adversaries are continuing to evolve their capability, exploiting the emergence of technology. And so, given that what we've got, or what we will have in 2025, is pretty well set, is very modern, and is the envy in many ways of our allies in Europe, we need to find a way to enhance the capability of those platforms as our adversaries advance their capabilities, so that we can stay relevant, that we can stay ahead of the threat and generate that kind of operational advantage. For me, that really means we've got to find ways of ensuring that we are able to rapidly and continuously integrate new technology into those platforms, into that capability, so that we stay ahead of the threat and are able to sustain that operational advantage. The conclusions of the work and the modernisation, the investment in the Air Force is that we have a very modern, very capable force, but we have one that where we need to get the absolute maximum out of the platforms that we've got to improve the level of defence outputs that we're able to generate. And we've got to find a way of incrementally improving and developing that technology such that we can stay up with the threat and give us that operational advantage that we're going to need if we're going to deter our adversaries, or if necessary, fight and win.
I mean, it sounds like you're in an argument that you can't stop, in a sense. What I'm getting at by that is that you talk about being in an enviable position as a result of recapitalisation and so on, and acknowledging that you've got to keep yourselves, the Royal Air Force, up to date with threats and whatever else. But if the minute what am I trying to say? If you make too much of being in a good position, an enviable position, having been recapitalised, then there's a danger that we go back through this cycle again. That the Royal Air Force is now not going to be capital intensive. You've got your slice, so you're all right. You're going to be fine for the next 15 years, and we'll concentrate on the other two. So it's a sort of Groundhog Day. We then go back to square one where we were before you were capitalised sufficiently, and we end up with a Royal Air Force that's behind the curve. Let's put it that way. So I suppose my question is, how do you keep this argument going? We all know that money is scarce, times are hard, and so on. How does an organisation such as the Royal Air Force, such as your organisation, keep that argument going? You've just had the money. You can't keep coming back for more. But what you're saying is you need to keep the investment topped up, which I must say sounds sensible to me.
Yeah, I think so. Your point is right in the sense of we do have to continuously and incrementally improve our capability. My central point, though, is that the big capital investment has already been made. We've made the big capital investment in the new platforms. My point is rather that we're not going to deliver enhancement in capability by buying new platforms, because the focus is rightly going to be elsewhere in defence. What modern technology offers is opportunities potentially to enhance that capability with the current platforms that we have. And for what it's worth, I think there are probably 4 key technology areas that are going to make a real difference to us. Space is the first, and I'll put that slightly to one side, although you'll know that the Air Force has Space Command within it and is responsible for development in that area. And space, and I'm sure we'll come on to it when we look at Ukraine, has played a really incredibly important part in how that campaign and that operation has been shaped. But the 3 technologies I would particularly focus on is, the first is the increasing ubiquity of automated systems, and in particular remotely piloted or entirely autonomous uncrewed systems. The second is around the use of synthetics and simulation to both train in, but also to develop our tactics and develop our understanding of the capabilities that are going to make the most difference. And then the third of those 3 particularly relevant to area is the exploitation of digital technology. And so and by that I mean the networks, connectivity, but also the application of digital technology in the likes of artificial intelligence and the exploitation of data that we are already seeing starting to make a real difference to the way in which operations play out and improving the speed with which we're able to make decisions and the way and the precision with which we are able to employ scarce physical resources to deliver precise effects at the time that we need it, where they're going to make the most difference in terms of unhinging our adversaries. So that's my point, is this: it's not about big capital investments for the Air Force over the next decade. We've got Future Combat Air System, the Global Combat Air Programme, but that's 10, 15 years away. So what we've got to do is get the most out of what we've got right now, and that's through this rapid continuous integration and exploitation of technology in the platforms and systems that we've currently got.
Thanks for that. That's very clear. So essentially, these things such as automated and unmanned systems, synthetics, and digital technology, you see these as force multipliers. I suppose that would be the expression. And what they can do is take this relatively up to date suite of platforms and keep them going through modernising and so on. So that makes a lot of sense. But can we stick with, I suppose, more? I mean, all of those technologies are pretty familiar, but the more over the horizon technology. I was thinking here of things like artificial intelligence and perhaps even quantum and so on. Do you engage with that raft of technologies in the same way, or is that too futuristic?
No. We do have to think about the whole portfolio of technology. But we also have to, but in thinking about that portfolio, we have to think of it in terms of a 20, even 30-year time frame. And we also have to think of it across a whole range of levels of maturity. So some of the technologies that we are seeing that are going to be built into the Future Combat Air System that will come into service in the late 2030s, 2040s, and we'll see it operating. That is technology and scientific research and investment that was made certainly in the 1990s, and some might argue was further back. So one of the important aspects of our thinking around science, technology, and innovation is making sure that we look at the totality of the portfolio, both in terms of where technology is today, where it's evolving to, and where it might get to, as well as looking at the threats and operational imperatives. So quantum, and particularly quantum sensing, may well play an important part in delivering aspects of military capability in the next 10, 20 years. And there's tons of debate about this in terms of exactly how much difference it will make. And we're not always great at predicting how technologies will evolve and which will emerge to become world-beating. And the old adage that we tend to overestimate technology in the short term and underestimate its impact in the long term, I think my own experience through my working life and career suggests that is true. But making sure that we've got, a broad understanding of that portfolio, and that where possible, we're exploiting the opportunities that come from partnerships. So defence spends a good chunk of its budget on science and technology and on research and development. But if you look at it across the totality of government spending and the totality of investment in science and technology in the country, it's a relatively small proportion. But there's tons of that work that's being done which could have impact and benefit for defence. And so one of the things that I'm trying to do with my Chief Technology Officer here and my team here is work out what are those opportunities for partnerships, either internationally but particularly domestically, with other government departments and academic institutions, so that we're only making that investment once, but we're seeking to extract the benefit from it in multiple places. And potentially, I'll be completely honest about it, shaping some of those decisions so that it helps defence the most it possibly can. And one of the things about the integrated review and the integrated review refresh that was super clear was that strategic advantage to a large extent is going to come from our investment in science and technology over the long term. And certainly from a defence perspective and an Air Force perspective, we should be seeking to support that, but also to shape it, focus it, and extract the maximum value for our wider security.
I mean, the Integrated Review 21 and the Refresh just published last week, by no means defence review documents. Of course they're not. We all know that, but they both cover an awful lot of ground. But it sounds as though, from your perspective, from the Royal Air Force's perspective, that what those two documents, and especially Refresh, say about science and technology is entirely consistent with your view. So as far as you're concerned, this is very good, solidly defensy.
Yeah, I mean, you might say these are foundational capabilities of a nation. I was talking the other day to a group of people at the Houses of Parliament, and to some extent, we judge the strength of a nation by the strength of its industry and its science and technology base, and I think that's well understood and generally received wisdom. So for the UK to be investing heavily in science and technology, that lays foundation stones on which we can build security and economic success, and ultimately support us in providing defence capability that can also ensure security and economic success.
In the short to medium term, you don't foresee any major changes in the shape, the size, the Royal Air Force's overall force posture. Are we going to be considering or reassessing very familiar debates such as the relationship between the Royal Navy and the Royal Air Force as far as the F-35 is concerned? Could the Army take more control of more of the rotary even and UAV stock that the UK has? What's going to happen to the Royal Air Force regiment? In other words, what I'm getting at is whether technology and these other improvements or changes that are going to come in, could they also result in major shifts between in the overall structure of the armed forces in the UK?
So where I stand today, and when I look at the structures and the capability that we know is in the pipeline over the next decade or so, I'm not sure that does argue for any kind of wholesale adjustment of responsibilities in defence for particular capabilities or areas of responsibility. I think that my experience tells me that those kind of debates are often not grounded in the fundamental question about how this is going to make defence better. And I'm a pragmatist. I'm an engineer, as you know. I'm about making things work and making things better. And so that for me is a kind of fundamental question. If a significant adjustment in structure or responsibility is going to make defence better, then we should think about it. And I don't think right now I see the emergence of technology that's going to fundamentally change that, because as I say, that the structures of the Air Force and the Navy and the capability that it's got are pretty well set. The Army is going to benefit from very, very significant investment in its equipment plan, or has already started over the next decade or so. And that is definitely going to see some adjustments in the way the Army is organised, and CGS and others have talked about that. But equally, I wouldn't want your listeners to think that I'm kind of complacent or not interested in those kind of debates. I think my point is I'm interested in those kind of debates if they're going to make a difference. If all they're going to do is exhaust the staffs and waste energy, then I'm really not sure that that's a good use of our time. We should be absolutely focused on making sure that the UK's armed forces are as good as they can be and as ready as they can be. And if there are many lessons from Ukraine, and as somebody said to me recently, we tend to only want to draw the lessons from Ukraine that we're comfortable with. But if there were one to draw, it must be that deterrence really matters, and deterrence matters. And to deter, you need to be credible, and that requires the UK armed forces to be as strong as we can make them.
Thanks for that. I suppose we do in the UK spend an awful lot of time in the defence debate, broadly defined, talking about inputs and where those inputs are coming from. And what you're saying as an engineer is actually outputs matter too, quite rightly.
Absolutely.
No, thanks for that. Yeah. Can we move on to, we'll just revisit really procurement and defence budgets and so on. And this is to ask really, what else is there in the procurement pipeline for the Royal Air Force? And regarding the budget, there was an additional 5 billion, I think it was, in the Integrated Review Refresh last week, which is all, as far as I've understood it, all going on the nuclear enterprise, 3 billion, and then another 2 billion on restocking and improving the ammunition infrastructure, not least as a result of our assistance to Ukraine. And I think another 6 billion is or might be or should be available through the budget announced last week. And then we also have this aspiration, I think that's the right word, to hit 2.5% of GDP when conditions allow. So the question there that pops up there in my mind is, and it goes back really to our earlier discussion about keeping this more capable, more modernised Royal Air Force up to speed. Is there enough in that? I don't want to draw you into a political discussion, and we have got the Defence Command paper, I think, coming out in June. So I'm not trying to draw you into that. But is this a good recipe for the Royal Air Force?
So I think if you look at both the integrated review and the integrated review refresh, both are absolutely clear that the international context is becoming more fragile, more dangerous. The terminology that was used in refresh around constant competition is something that we have seen play out over the last few years. In the refresh, we talk about a more contested and volatile world. And in both cases, and the refresh is obviously the most recent, it's clear that defence and defence capability is a plank of the UK's response to that more dangerous, more volatile, more contested world in which we live. And so as a foundation stone for a conversation about what is the defence capability that the country needs, it seems to me that the IR refresh provides a really thoughtful, strong, clear foundation for us to ask ourselves those questions. What contribution should defence make to the long-term security of the country and our interests around the world? And actually, therefore, provides the structure, the sequencing of the IR refresh followed by the Defence Command paper seems to me to be entirely logical. The question of how much should a nation spend on its defence budget is quite rightly a political question. It's a question for the government of the day to take, and it's always very easy for those who don't have to make those decisions, and I know I've been in this position for the last few years, is to argue for more, but governments and ministers have to make difficult balancing act decisions, and that's the judgment that this government and successive governments will have to make as we go through future defence reviews and integrated reviews processes. But is the IR refresh a good foundation for us to think about what is the defence? What is it that defence contributes to our security? Yeah, absolutely. And as the Air Force, as a subset of defence, I think it's really clear that it seems to me that the events over the last 2 years and what the integrated review refresh sets out is that defence and the Air Force as part of defence has got a critical role to play in terms of deterrence and securing the UK's interest and securing the UK's borders and nation.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you very much for that. I've for my pains, I've looked at defence reviews. I think every one of them since 1945. How sad is that? And the impression I'm left with is that there's never ever been a single number that would answer all of our problems. The problems, of course, are addressed, and insofar as we have the resources to meet them, and so on. So there's always that exchange between resources and the demand on the resources. I think the refresh does look pretty considered. I must say, I think it looks a bit more organised than its predecessor. It does look considered, and there does seem to be scope for considering problems as they arise from a financial perspective. I was going to ask as well about the Global Combat Air Programme. I wonder if you could say a word or two about that, because of course that is mentioned in the refresh, and I think the wording is that it will require further investment, as will AUKUS, the submarine arrangement with the Australians. They will require further investment in the years ahead. So there's an acknowledgement there that the Royal Air Force, your service and your capabilities and so on, are going to need further top-ups over the years ahead.
GCAP, Global Combat Air Programme, is a remarkable thing. It signals a potentially century-long relationship with Japan and Italy. I mean, it's going to take 15 years to get ourselves to the initial operating capability, it'll continue to evolve, and it will be in service for, based on past history, maybe 40, 50 years. So this is an absolutely remarkable agreement between the UK, Italy and Japan. There's about £10 billion been allocated to it for the decade of the 2020s. There's a big investment decision in around end of 24, beginning of 25 that will need to be made, which will secure the kind of next phase of it. And there's no funding not sort of allocated beyond 2030 because we don't have budgets that run out that far. But certainly in our planning assumptions in defence, we absolutely recognise that this programme would run for 50, 60, 70 years, and that would need to be funded over all of that period. So when it talks about needing more funding, it's a key decision about the programme in the late 24, early 25, and then there's this funding beyond 2030 to take it right the way through to manufacture, delivery, and then hopefully on into operational service and exports potentially as well. So that's what that's referring to. But absolutely remarkable agreement and real demonstration of the quality of the technology and aerospace industries in Japan, Italy and the United Kingdom.
You often hear the word affordable popping up in defence debates in the UK, and I've usually argued against the use of that word because it seems to me that the amount you spend on defence is a political choice. And we are a big economy, we can spend more if we want, but that also means spending less on other things. So it's that reshuffling of commitments. But is this affordable? If we are going to be committing billions and billions in this remarkable programme, as you called it, is that going to mean that other things will become less affordable, such as the Army's role, if it has one, in European defence, surface warships and so on? Can we afford to do all these things at that level of expenditure?
So certainly over the next 10 years, or certainly to the end of this decade, which was the bit I was heavily involved with in my previous role, yeah, absolutely. That the programme was built and the funding allocated on the basis that we would have to modernise and recapitalise the Army, we would increase the level of investment in shipbuilding, and we would fund the FCAS programme and grow the size of the F-35 fleet from a Air Force and Navy perspective. So that was built in and that was funded and that was affordable. In fact, there was even some headroom towards the back end of the decade. Now things have changed a bit since then. We've had inflation running at 10, 11 plus %, and clearly that will affect the affordability of all sorts of government programmes going forward. But the plan that was set out in SR20 was definitively affordable, and that's what the Public Accounts Committee said when we took the equipment plan to them in 2021 and again last year in 2022. But as you've heard in the debate, some things have changed. We've seen war in Europe. We've seen a need to reassess the risk that we took in terms of our stockpiles, and we're investing more in to strengthen that and strengthen the industry's capacity to generate the weapons that we might need. And we've seen this really quite significant impact of inflation, and who knows what the Armed Forces Pay Review Body is going to say, but pay inflation that sits alongside it as well. And you referred to it in your kind of run up to the question, which is this: everything's affordable, depending on the priorities that government make, and that is the challenge for ministers to consider through the spending review that's just gone, which we know the outcome of, and the spending review that will come. I think I understand there's expected to be a further spending review in 2024. As well, and that's where we'll need to assess those things. And I'm sure the Defence Command paper will pull some of this out as well.
Yeah, I suppose what I meant by affordable in this context was whether it would be affordable within the defence envelope, or would it require distractions, as it were, from the other services. But no, absolutely take your point. Yes, of course it can if we supervise it all carefully enough. Can we come now to the strategic level? And a couple of questions really about our participation in alliance operations. I mean, I'm using the word multilateral and alliance or NATO operations. I'm thinking, of course, specifically about our support to Ukraine. And I'm wondering really, as everybody is, are we doing enough? Could we be doing more? Should we be doing more? And so on. I completely understand, as I think everybody does, that the operation in Ukraine is not and should not be, must not become even seen as a NATO operation. That would be a huge step to take, and none of us want to take it. But nevertheless, I do wonder whether NATO countries such as our own could be doing more, for example, in your area, to be training Ukrainian pilots to fly and fight aircraft other than MiGs and Sukhois and so on. Is there more that we could be doing in your area, do you think?
I mean, if let me deal with pilot training first, and I'll talk about other areas where I think we are helping and where we will continue to help. I mean, in terms of pilot training, the time it takes to train a fast jet pilot from walking in off the street to getting to the front line, if everything runs absolutely perfectly, there's no gaps and nobody fails and there's no bad weather, you're talking kind of 4 years. And that's pretty standard across NATO nations and allies and our adversaries. I mean, it's not like 1938, 1939, where you could go to the front line with a couple of hundred hours and fly a Spitfire or a Hurricane, relatively complicated aeroplanes, but nothing like as complex as the aircraft that we look at today. The idea that we could start training pilots today and they're going to roll themselves out to the front line in the next few months is just not realistic. Where you could imagine the UK or other allied nations training pilots being helpful is for the longer term. We don't have a plan yet as an international community of quite what that long term should look like. And right now, if you were to take a pilot from Ukraine and train them in the UK, two things. First of all, you're denuding the front line of that pilot, and the Ukrainian armed forces need all of the pilots they've got right now, I understand. And secondly, in bringing them back to the UK, if you wanted to train them on Typhoon, for example, Ukraine does not yet have Typhoon aircraft, and at the moment there isn't a plan to do so. So, I look at this from a practical sense. What is going to make the most difference for Ukraine and give Ukraine the best opportunity to repulse this illegal invasion by Russia? Well, what's going to make the difference actually is in supporting them with weapons specifically, and particularly air defence capability. And the UK has already provided weapons and air defence capability and continues to provide training for ground troops and an aircrew in more tactics and techniques and procedures that will help them to defeat or repel the Russian attackers.
The integrated review, the refresh, last week's version, offers a strategic view, let's call it that, which is in some respects everything but what you and I might call traditional strategy. In other words, the organisation and use of armed force. We all know that the word strategy has been overtaken up by every organisation and so on. So, but that's fine. I'm not complaining about that. Well, not too much anyway. We have reference in the review, in the refresh, to I counted as many as 22 other strategies: border strategy, AI strategy, energy strategy, space strategy, and perhaps we'll come back to that in a minute. That's one point. My other point is that things like economic deterrence, soft power, S&T, science and technology advantage, and so on, it seems to me that all of these should be part of a national competitive outlook. Of course they have to be. But I do wonder, as I read this document and I see all these other strategies, I do wonder whether there's a certain crowding out going. Ironically, in a strategic document, a crowding out of what we would call traditional strategy, which is the use of hard power.
One of my reflections of having been heavily involved in the integrated review in 2020 and the previous reviews we did in 17 and 18, Modernising Defence Programme, prior to that as well, is that it is really complex, and that the reason for the reference to a whole range of strategies in the IR review refresh document is, I think, partly a reflection of the complexity. And actually what the IR review refresh and John Bew and the team have tried to do is provide what my Foreign Office colleagues describe as the chapeau, but to provide that capping document that sets out the overall intent and direction. And I think actually the document's pretty clear, and clearer than perhaps we've been for some time, about the importance of hard power and defence in particular and the contribution it makes to furthering the UK's interests in the world, protecting the UK's interests in the world, and generating security for the UK. I think there is a wider question about whether we have an operating concept for the character of warfare, or that we're starting to see emerge we had the integrated operating concept that was published in 2020, which I think was a very good attempt at trying to describe the way of warfare in terms of the kind of constant competition that was set out. But a broader future operating concept that unifies the operate and warfight and articulates the way in which we will fight, and then leads to deductions about the kind of capabilities that we will need and we need to invest in. That isn't available yet, and that's a piece of work that the Doctrine and Concepts Centre in Shrivenham is working hard on. In fact, I've got a session tomorrow with the other services and the Vice Chief to talk about the early draft of this future operating concept. So if part of your question is around that, I think I would agree with you. There is a gap there, and there is a need for us to fill that gap and apply the intellectual effort to describing how we will fight in the future, and to really help us from that focus on the particular capabilities, training, alliances that we need to work on over the next few years.
Thanks for that. How we will fight, and I suppose my next question is where we will fight. And another impression from the Refresh document is that, and again, I've read it once and I haven't been involved in writing the thing, but I do have a slight sense that we're maybe a little bit confused about how we see China. Is China a threat? Is China a country with whom we should collaborate? 1.4 billion people, and we all know the economic relationship, the trading relationship, and so on. Are we going to collaborate with China? Are we going to compete with them, or are we going to try and contain China? And I wondered what your view might be. How does the Royal Air Force see China?
So I think the Prime Minister described it, I know, in the foreword to the IR Refresh as the epoch-defining challenge with China. At page 33, it talks about the UK's policy towards China. And I think that what the document was doing, and the sort of debate that's happened since the document was published, rather illustrates the challenge for strategists and policymakers, in that China is all of the things you describe. It is a challenge, it is a threat, it is a trading partner, it is a key contributor to global stability, potentially. It's not really necessarily behaving in that way right now. And a policy and a strategy towards China has to deal with all of those complexities and different perspectives. And I think I could say I'm glad I'm not writing it, and John Bew and others are writing it.
Yeah, thanks for that. It's a very good answer. I mean, you can see the difficulties, can't you, as you read the document in presenting such a behemoth of a political and strategic problem as China. A problem for a country of our size, certainly. Well, I guess for everybody, really. Can we come to then the final question, which is Space Command? What's going on? What's going on?
It's the final frontier. My favourite quote was the US space guys briefed me at Staff College. You had a badge that said "Space is the highest high ground," and that's always stuck with me. That has. I think what we are seeing in a practical sense is that by forming Space Command, appointing somebody as the commander for Space Command, and starting to build up the capacity and focus Defence's space capability into a single place, is you starting to see connections made internationally and domestically, industrially and internationally with partners. We're seeing the focus and understanding and prominence of space and space operations in the dialogue, in the conversations that occur around defence, really grow. And what the IR did was put behind some of those organisational adjustments and changes and that focus around space and its importance, actually put money around it to allow us to invest in the development of capability for the UK. Quite deliberately, the jury is to some extent out on quite what that's going to look like. We have a plan. It was laid out in the defence space strategy that I and my team were closely involved with writing in my last job. Paul Godfrey, as the commander for Space Command, is driving that work forward with his capability people. He's got the Space Ops Centre here at Air Command. He's built fantastic relationships out with other nations, many of whom are on the same journey, some a little bit further behind. And Australia's perhaps a year behind in terms of its setting up its Space Command. France has done the same sort of thing as well. So I think we are all pointing in a similar sort of direction, and I like what the establishment of Space Command has done is provided this focal point for it. It's provided a degree of expertise, and we are seeing that play out in advice to ministers, in advice to senior commanders, in wargaming, and in training and exercising. And I think that we are in a much stronger position having established that, and with it being sort of parented with its the Air Force with its arms around it to nurture it on behalf of defence. It's not for the Air Force; it's on behalf of defence. So I'm pretty positive and optimistic about the work that Paul Godfrey and his team there have done. But I'm also realistic to note that there's a long way to go. The UK doesn't have many space-based assets at the moment, and we've seen the importance of space as a operational domain play out probably for the first time in Ukraine, and that mix of commercial and military capability on orbit has really opened many people's eyes, I think, to the importance of the domain and the complexity of it, and as I say, particularly from a commercial and military sense as well.
As you were talking there, Marshal, it struck me that really it's becoming more and more difficult to imagine a sophisticated armed force that doesn't have a space command, I suppose, any more than you could not have a cyber command. But you said one thing you said lots of things that were interesting, but one interesting point that you said was that Space Command is constructed and will deliver on behalf of defence. If that's the case, why isn't it in Strategic Command?
So I was heavily involved in the debate about where it should sit and where the logical and best place was. And you can make a case for it to sit in Strategic Command, but if you look at where the people are with the right experience and qualifications, actually where physically where the Space Ops Centre is, it's here at High Wycombe at Air Command. And after considerable debate, the conclusion was that we would put it inside Air Command. And actually, if you look at our allies, that's a similar model to the one that they have established. Sometimes people say to me, "Can you imagine a situation in the future where you would have a separate Space Command in the way that the US has gone to?" I guess I can, but it's not in the foreseeable future, and it's a relatively small organisation, a couple of hundred more people. This is the size of a squadron, a large squadron at the moment. It's not something you would want to spin out as a separate entity just yet. And so for now, the focus has got to be on the Air Force nurturing it, as I said, on behalf of defence.
Well, look, thank you very much indeed. We've come to the end of our allotted hour. Can I just finish by thanking all of your staff who've been involved in setting this up, together with my colleagues at Cityforum, and indeed to thank all of our Cityforum listeners for their interest. But really, mainly to thank you, Marshal, for really generously giving us your time yet again. We're very grateful. Thank you very much indeed, and perhaps we'll see you again for another podcast sometime in the future. Thank you very much.
It's been a pleasure, Paul. Great to see you again, and thanks very much.